It's odd to think back on an era where Electronic Arts, of all companies, was interested in exploring new IPs and game ideas, as opposed to constant sequels, spin-offs, or DLC. EA had been successful for many years, publishing countless best-selling titles and having access to a multitude of best-selling franchises. But therein lies the problem. EA had successful original IPs such as The Sims or Battlefield, but most of their catalog was using licensed properties. They didn't want to be relying on brands created by others to keep them afloat, and so they tasked many of the studios they owned with creating original IPs for the company that they could rely on for years to come, including Dead Space, Army of Two, and of course, Mirror's Edge. It also helps that they bought BioWare around this time, giving them access to Mass Effect and Dragon Age. DICE, the developers of Battlefield, oversaw development of the game, and their goal was to take their experience with first-person shooters and create a game in that genre that was unlike anything in the market. The growing rise of parkour in movies and video games helped bloom the concept for the game, as the idea of parkour mechanics in a first-person perspective was alien at the time. This proved to be a challenging task, as the amount of animation work required to properly convey the player's speed, direction, and placement in the world was relentless. For example, climbing or descending a ladder in Mirror's Edge has around 40 different possible animations based on the direction and speed in which you grab onto it and traverse it. The player's spatial awareness takes a huge hit when in this perspective, so it was an uphill battle constantly changing FOV, animations, and environments to suit the game. The setting and art direction was created to give the sense of breaking free of comfortable constraints and living life on the edge, and thus the city with its heavenly look that hides a dystopian nanny state underneath was decided upon. When you're jumping off rooftops way above the average person as law enforcement is hot on your tail, you do get something close to feeling like a bird flying above the pedestrians below. Mirror's Edge was, and still is, a very bright and colourful game, which contrasted against a lot of other first-person games back then going for more dulled colours. Other genres went in that direction too, so seeing a gorgeous city landscape with bright blues, reds, oranges, and greens made the game stand out artistically from much of the competition. Yet, despite all of this, the game was considered a commercial disappointment. Electronic Arts predicted the game to move about 3 million units, but the game struggled to sell 2.5 million by June 2013, almost 5 years later. The game did gain a strong reputation for its unique gameplay, setting, and soundtrack, but the fate of the game led EA to reboot Mirror's Edge in 2016 with Catalyst, a game which had one of the most lukewarm receptions I've ever seen. But despite that, there is a dedicated fanbase who still go back to the original game and hold it up as a classic that innovated first-person movement mechanics greatly. So what does Mirror's Edge achieve or fail to achieve that other games could learn from? The inertia system in Mirror's Edge makes for interesting traversal by itself. Instead of a sprint button to go faster, Faith has to gain speed by running. This means that unlike most games, which have set speeds at which the player travels, Faith's speed is entirely based on the player's ability to continuously pass over areas without stopping or making major decreases in inertia. And that inertia is carried over into any of Faith's abilities that you use. A jump without any build-up does very little, whereas having a running start makes you jump further and higher, which also means that how you climb obstacles is impacted by this system. Jumping whilst running does temporarily increase your speed, but there's a slight decrease when you hit the ground. So jumping continuously for no reason is a hindrance, unlike most games where jumping is always faster. Faith can also slide under and vault over objects, as well as wall run. She can also reverse jump off walls, which gives her plenty of horizontal and vertical movement. And if she falls from a high place, she can roll to break her fall, though falling too high will kill her regardless, so you have to judge the distance of the drop. Mirror's Edge's mechanics are fairly static. There's no unlocks you obtain throughout playing the game. The moveset you have at the beginning is the exact same you have at the end. But the game uses those static mechanics to test the player's skills and mastery of a move or combining multiple moves together in a sequence. For example, you can wall run, jump to a nearby wall, then run up that and jump off behind to reach an area. Or if you think you won't make a landing because your legs will clip the floor, then you can coil your legs mid-jump to heighten your hitbox at the cost of distance. And because the game encourages combinations of moves as opposed to just doing one sequence at a time, there's a strong learning curve to mastering Faith's inertia, timing of inputs, and positioning, to either get through an area faster or go a route you would previously believe was impossible. You see this in countless YouTube videos of people exploiting and pushing the systems to their limits, sometimes in ways the developers never intended. What this means is that the challenge in the game comes from high-pressure situations of figuring out where to go and how to get there. However, I think the game could have gone further in this area. You see, whilst there is a huge amount of mechanical depth to Mirror's Edge, a lot of that comes from exploiting the game's mechanics. Most of the chase sequences are designed to be played in a very linear way, where you press this button to go here at this specific point. It doesn't help that runner's vision removes much of the challenge. It highlights objects in red to show you the intended path to the goal. In doing this, the game is essentially doing the thinking on the spot for you and thus taking the pressure away during chase sequences, since I would never have to second guess where I'm going or if what I'm doing is the correct thing. Thankfully, you can turn this off, and it's turned off by default on hard mode, which you unlock after beating the game. It's how I'd recommend playing the game, since it does make you pay attention a lot more to the environment. And I know somebody will mention it, but yes, I am aware of the creative ways to get through sections, because due to the unrestricted nature of the movement, there is usually more than one way to get through an area. The most creative ways are either getting to sections that would normally be restricted, or skipping some sections entirely to get more time off, which is especially helpful during speedruns or time trials. However, there are some odd times of the illusion of choice, where the game will give you two different paths to go, which lead you to the same place and take the same amount of challenge to get there, and that doesn't make the game more interesting. I know why that was done for design purposes, because it's easier to plan, program, and playtest sections that are very finite in their approach, but it ends up making me wish the game had a bit more beyond that, and did way more to encourage parkour mastery. For example, imagine if instead of failure of a sequence pretty much always immediately leading to Faith's death and or forcing her to redo the section, why not have it so where sometimes it'll lead Faith to a different part of the level where she has to face different challenges, or take longer to get to the goal and miss out on collectible bags. Sort of similar to how Sonic the Hedgehog does level design. The idea being that the punishment for failure isn't always redoing the level, it's continuing the level with the knowledge that you made a mistake, and the game's punishing you for it by making you fight your way back to where you should be, whereas mastering the level rewards you by giving you faster and more interesting ways to get around. Maybe even a weapon or something to help you get through the next encounter. In Mirror's Edge, failing is usually always just being sent back to a checkpoint, which works, and thankfully reloading in this game is actually quite fast. But I think there's ways you can make this gameplay loop more compelling. Thankfully though, the game is very well paced, and it manages to implement the parkour in both high and low stress situations in a very commendable way. If the game was just non-stop chases, it would get old fast. So the levels often start with very low stress parkouring, where the player has an indefinite amount of time to figure out the surroundings. Oftentimes they'll be placed in the middle of a level 2, so as to give the player a bit of a breather before the heat comes back on. And these sections also tend to have more complicated movement, so despite not having much pressure, they still provide a decent challenge as it sort of acts as a parkour puzzle. Overall, Mirror's Edge is mechanically a very beautiful game with a lot of depth that is somewhat lost in translation with its approach to level design, and some of the hand-holding can be annoying. But I do think critics overstate the game's linearity. There is freedom in this game, you just have to earn it. Another thing I've heard many criticize about the game is the combat mechanics, but in truth it actually is well developed mechanically. You have a variety of attacks to perform. The standard punch comes out quick and doesn't require much setup. 3 in a row will blow the enemy back, or even with weaker enemies knock them out completely, but you're very stationary when performing it and there's a recovery window, leaving you open to attack. You can punch dudes in the crotch too, which is funny, and it stuns them for a few seconds, so there actually is mechanical use to it. The most effective melee moves are often ones with momentum behind them, as they make you harder to hit and deal more damage, such as kicking from a wall run, running and doing a jump kick, or sliding and kicking. You can jump and kick in place too. You also have plenty of spacing options too, as pressing jump whilst moving left or right will cause Faith to do a little hop in that direction, which is useful for evading incoming attacks or getting behind enemies for an instant takedown. The problem though is the vast majority of the moveset is useless for a few reasons. 1. Disarms. When Faith is close to an enemy, they will attempt to melee her, and when this happens, there will be a small period where the gun is highlighted red. You can then counter and instantly take down the opponent and obtain their gun immediately afterwards. The timing can be difficult on some enemies, but the game does have a slowdown feature which needs to be recharged. The problem here is, why would I bother doing any cool combat moves when the most effective way to deal with any enemy in the game is walk up to them and disarm them? The only skill required is timing, and it immediately takes them out the battle, and I get a weapon to use afterwards. And if I don't want to use the gun, I can just toss it. So why bother with planning out or positioning attacks? The second problem is that there's very few melee-focused enemies in the game. The Pursuit Cops and the Assassin fight are the only enemies to be based around melee. These enemies can't be beaten with a simple disarm. You either have to use positioning to get behind them and take them out, or use melee whilst avoiding their attacks. During these sections, you actually get somewhat of an interesting idea of what this game's combat system could be like, since spacing is rewarded more than just timing. But then there's the third problem. The slide kick. The slide kick is overpowered. Even if an enemy tries to melee you when performing it, their attack is extremely likely to just go over you, which gives an edge over every other attack which can be interrupted. So even the Pursuit Cops can be defeated easily just by spamming slide kick. What's worse is that these sections heavily encourage you to just ignore them and keep moving. I don't get the idea behind that. You design a first-person combat system and then you say the optimal option is to not use it. On a more positive note, I do like how the guns affect parkour. The heavier the weapon, the slower you are, and the less jump height you have. Because you're playing as a skinny woman whose strength is speed and agility. So a pistol or an SMG can still be parkoured with, as it wouldn't slow Faith down much, but a shotgun or a heavy machine gun are next to impossible to traverse with. This works for balancing and game design, since it makes these weapons useful, as they are extremely powerful, but it also does a good job reminding the player that speed and momentum are the best tools they have. It also prevents them from bringing one heavy weapon into another encounter. The only weapons they can carry are on the smaller side, which still rewards the player for planning ahead without completely breaking the balance of the game. Also, guns can't be reloaded. Once they run out of ammo, Faith ditches them. So weapons have a very ephemeral use to them, and it encourages the player to keep moving from one enemy to the next, as opposed to camping with a gun. Weapons also have a ridiculous amount of weapon sway, so it's insanely difficult to use them at medium to long range, aside from the sniper rifle. So you're encouraged to get up close and personal. It's a shame because I really do see the potential here. DICE are well experienced with the genre, and the idea of a combat system that mixes melee and shooting with parkour is an awesome idea. But there's very little to do in the game itself, and even with these options, you are mostly just pigeonholed into two options during combat. The bottom line is I think Mirror's Edge leaves a lot to be desired. I would like to see someone revisit these ideas, as I do believe there's a genuinely awesome game somewhere in here. I think if they did a sequel or a spiritual successor with more enemy melee variety with different attack styles and patterns for the player to figure out and counterattack, that could make for an engaging combat system, especially if the parkour is implemented and encouraged for fights. And there's plenty of good first-person combat systems both before and after this game released to look at, such as Dying Light, Dishonored, Dark Messiah of Might and Magic, Escape from Butcher Bay. So you can look to those games for inspiration of inputs, camera movement, and movesets, and interesting decisions in the combat system overall for the player to make. And you could use that to develop the combat system of Mirror's Edge into something really unique. You would think maybe 8 years later they would do that, but... Okay, I'll be fair, Catalyst does improve in some aspects, but it still has about as much depth as a sheet of paper, and the combat is very automated in that game. The reason I'm so critical is because I see a lot of potential in this game, but I don't think we're ever gonna get an opportunity to see what Mirror's Edge could become at its best, because the franchise has been put on ice and I don't really see anyone making a spiritual successor anytime soon. Exploration is a bit limited, but there are things to find off the beaten path, such as bags, which give you unlocks such as artwork and music, more on that in a bit. These add to the world building of the game, since these are bags discarded by runners in trouble who leave them to be collected later, and they have a call sign to mark them. I think it would have been more interesting if the contents of each of the bags was shown or told to the player. It would give each of them their own short story and would help flesh out the different corporations and runners, thus adding to the world. As I said, the game's use of color is handled very well. It's very saturated without being overbearing. The game usually goes for a strong primary such as a blue, green or orange or red, mixed with white or black, and maybe a few spruces of color along the way. A lot of games that want to be colourful just throw a bunch of colours onto the screen and it just turns the game into a rainbow unicorn. Mirror's Edge is a good example of how to make your game saturated while still being modest. The runners have a rebellious punk look, which is fitting considering how they function. The police have a more grounded yet sleek look to them, with darker, less vibrant colours, which also works for the gameplay because they stand out more against the environment. The more dangerous cops wear body armor to help signify that they're tougher to take down, and Faith herself is pretty iconic with her 3 colors of red, white and black, and her athletic outfit. And her athletic outfit signifying her abilities, as well as the tattoos on her arm and eye. The art direction of this game still stands strong today, and it's one of the best looking games on Unreal Engine 3. And it makes the exploration of this game fun in and of itself. Aside from collectibles, there's 2 bonus modes with time trials and speedrun mode, and these are where the game is at its best in my opinion. Speedrun mode is all of the levels but with a timer. The goal is simple, get the best time on the level. The game is polite as well, and it stops the timer during cutscenes and sections with predetermined times such as lifts. I personally think this is way more rewarding than the main story, since there's an incentive to get better, especially since the game had leaderboards at release, so you could compete with others like an arcade game. DICE themselves has said that Mirror's Edge was heavily inspired by racing games, and you can see that with these extra modes. Time trials are awesome too. They're custom sections of maps, made with reaching goals in a time limit that has 3 different ranks depending on how fast you are. And you need to be reaching those high ranks since you need a certain number of them to get access to the later levels. So there's an incentive to get better at the game to see more of the content. Part of me wishes they implemented these more into the game's structure itself instead of just bonus modes, but it's welcome nonetheless. It is known that there was a multiplayer mode planned for the game where one team would play as runners and the other would play as cops hunting them, but this was scrapped during the alpha period of the game. I think there's room to add more stuff. If the combat was more developed, I would have welcomed combat challenges or even a horde mode. Or maybe a challenge mode where you get special pickups when progressing through the levels, such as double speed, strength or jump height. Something silly just to add more wacky ways to play the game. Or a challenge mode that disables specific parkour abilities to force the player to find more creative ways around the area. Maybe these ideas wouldn't work in practice, I am just brainstorming. Either way, if you're a fan of replaying and mastering levels and mechanics, then Mirror's Edge certainly has that value going for it. Which then brings us to the story and characters, and it's certainly not one of the game's strong suits. The basic premise is that there's a city just called The City, that is a nanny state watching over the population. There's underground gangs and corrupt officials, and in the middle of all of it are the runners who seek to uncover sensitive information hidden by law enforcement. You play as Faith Connors and you get caught up in a conspiracy plot where Faith's sister Kate, who is a police officer, is framed for a murder she didn't commit, and Faith has to prove her innocence, whilst figuring out why this person, Robert Pope, was murdered to begin with.
He was alive when I got here, just sitting at his desk, writing. Everything went black. When I came to, he'd been shot. And I'm pretty sure it was with my gun. There was a book on the desk, a diary. It was gone. I'm sure there was someone else in the building. Left my radio in the car, haven't had time to phone it in.
Come on, come with me. I'll take you somewhere safe.
This isn't the time to run. I'm not like you. Running will just make me look guilty.
You think this was an accident, Kate? There are no accidents in this city. Someone wanted him dead and wanted you to take the fall.
She goes from source to source to get leads on how to clear her name, but it ends up being pointless at the end of the game because Faith saves her sister from being taken into custody, and then they just run from the law. So Faith really accomplishes nothing over the course of the game, which I actually wouldn't have a problem with if the ending wasn't framed in such a grand or heroic way, but it is. And it's stupid too because the whole reason that Robert Pope was murdered and Kate was framed for it was to hide Project Icarus from the public, or at least stop that project from being destroyed, and it turns out all this project is Parkour Police. Like, this is the project that Pope was trying to shut down. This is what they feared the public knowing about. Police that can do parkour. This is why he was assassinated. And the game treats this ultimate parkour unit police as if they're going to be a serious threat, but I can take them down 3-1 with no issue, and I'm a skinny woman in a tank top. They have stun guns, which they never use, and armor and professional training, and I still manage to beat them. So yeah, the whole conspiracy plot is dumb and stupid. It also turns out that Celeste, who is a fellow runner, is actually a double agent who was working for law enforcement to help Project Icarus, and she was the one hired to kill Robert Pope. And when she framed Kate for the murder, she was completely unaware that it was Faith's sister. At first it seems like she's going in a direction that could be interesting. She talks to Faith about how she's grown tired of the runner life and wishes for more.
What you're doing now, Faith, is the fastest way to get yourself killed.
They got my sister involved, Sel. And I need to clear her name. I owe her that much. I'll survive. That's what we do.
Survival is overrated. You need to live a little, too.
But then it's undermined by saying she was blackmailed into doing this. What the blackmail was, we never know. They never explain it. And personally, I think it would have made for a more compelling character if she betrayed the runners, not because she was forced to, but because her values and perspective on life changed and evolved over the course of her time as a runner. It would have added more to the theme of freedom, in that freedom of choice also means freedom to oppose, even those you would consider friends or allies. Faith herself doesn't really have much to speak about. Her character design is iconic, as said, and very memorable, but she has no defining personality traits. I guess she's a no-nonsense type who also values her sister and still loves her and tries to protect her despite being on opposite sides of the law, but the game doesn't really do enough to make her entertaining to watch as the story unfolds. We get some backstory about how her mother was killed in the riots opposing the new regime, which led to her family falling apart and her abandoning them to live on the streets. This also is expanded a bit upon in the comic that was released. It's clear that part of her regrets leaving her sister behind and that she views this journey of clearing her name as making up for that, which only makes the ending even worse because she fails to do so. I mean, she does stop her sister from being executed, so there is that, but now Kate has to live as a fugitive for the rest of her life. I don't really get the point the game is trying to make here. Plus, I have no idea how Faith and Kate managed to escape at the end. They're at the top of the shard, which is being stormed with security like no tomorrow, and the only way off that rooftop was just destroyed. There's just really no sense of accomplishment with this game. The servers in the shard do get destroyed at the end, but there's definitely backup ones somewhere like there is in the real world for most things. Most of the other characters have even less to speak about, and mostly just play the roles of exposition. And that's a big problem with this game. Instead of using these cutscenes to flesh out the world or characters and their dynamics, it instead mostly just comes down to Faith meeting someone who tells her where to go next. It's mostly just signposting. So there's no interesting character dynamics, the world barely gets fleshed out beyond the conceptual stages, and as a conspiracy plot, it fails. But probably the worst thing about this game is that the villain never appears. The dude behind this whole scheme never appears once in the game. He's mentioned, but you never confront him, and so at the last second they just pull jackknife this guy you meet maybe twice in the game, and he just becomes the villain at the end, and then you kick him out of a helicopter.
Who's behind this?
Let's just say I know who the bigger fish are.
Callahan. Why us? We're no threat.
Classic warfare. Break the lines of communication. Shoot the messengers. Without hope. And without the runners. Your clients. Those who just won't let go of the old city being cut off. Vulnerable. Then this city can clean up the last of its dregs.
So this is just the start.
I prefer to think of it as an ending.
This story was definitely rushed, and you can tell this as well just by playing the game, because the final area was going to be an epic showdown, and you can tell that from the level design, but they cut it and made it into a cutscene. Awesome. I've heard criticism towards the 2D cutscenes, which I can somewhat understand. They aren't exactly groundbreaking, and I do think some scenes would be more effective done from the first-person perspective. In fact, cut content shows that some of the scenes were originally meant to be in-engine first-person cutscenes, but they went with the 2D animation style in the end. I do think they add a unique style of presentation to the game, but the way the characters are animated doesn't really allow them to be very expressive. I like the idea of the animated cutscenes, but in practice they do just feel like a strange inclusion, especially since the first-person cutscenes are actually surprisingly well directed and choreographed. The story of Mirror's Edge is representative of the whole experience. It has a lot of potential for expansion, but it never really went beyond a conceptual proof-of-concept rendition with its ideas, and as such it's hard for me to look back at the story of this game beyond just a series of ideas. However, if there's something in the game I have little to no complaints about, it's the music. Composed by Solar Fields, Mirror's Edge has very high, almost angelic sounding tracks, which do a great job at making the player feel like they're far above the ground, maneuvering through the air. It makes for a calm atmosphere when platforming, showing off the fun of parkour and the satisfaction, with some digital sound effects mixed in to convey the futuristic technology fixated and sleek city. When you get into combat, it goes full-on electronic adrenaline, as if the previously free feeling has been overtaken by the lore. And during sections where it calms down a bit and you have to figure out where to go next, it plays calmer electronic notes to keep the player's concentration without overwhelming them. The main menu music is pretty iconic. It's tame and calming, which, when mixed with the digital sound effects of the main menu and the color palettes, makes for a pretty heavenly feel when exploring the main menu. Of course though, you can't really talk about Mirror's Edge without Still Alive. It's overpoweringly upbeat, making for a great contrast against the world of the game and what Faith is striving for. The soundtrack is very well composed and fits with the gameplay situations almost perfectly. I really have no complaints. It's memorable and has plenty of style. It's a shame that this period of Electronic Arts wanting to invest in new IPs didn't last for long. They had many talented developers, and I think if EA kept pushing for a bit longer, we could have had plenty of new games that had really innovative gameplay. Imagine if we got a proper sequel to Mirror's Edge that used the first as a launchpad into something fantastic. Instead, we got a reboot which, whilst a competent game, it's not nearly as beloved and failed to expand upon the first game in any meaningful way. Thankfully, first-person parkour has been used in many games since, and whilst none of them have as much depth by themselves, those developers managed to combine it with many other gameplay mechanics to create a system with plenty of functionality, as it speaks well to a strong core gameplay loop. At the very least, I hope a game comes along someday that makes Mirror's Edge into the game it could have been, whether it be another installment or a new IP made by a different studio. There's plenty of inspiration to look for and ideas to expand upon in this title from 2008, and it would be a shame for it to only remain as untapped potential. So, in case you're wondering what took so long with this video, because I promised it'd be out in a week, 3 weeks prior to this video releasing, yeah, I'm great with release schedules. There's two simple answers. One, I was sick for a bit, which kind of left me unable to work on the video, and two, I was busy dealing with some stuff, which was unfortunate because whenever I wanted to work on the video, I had stuff to do, and whenever I didn't have stuff to do, I didn't feel like working on the video. It's an annoying situation, but hey, got the video out in the end. Please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I know my release schedules are really infrequent, but I do appreciate people watching and engaging with the video. And I will be discussing with people in the comments below about the game and its mechanics or potential ideas, or just random other stuff, I don't know. Either way, hopefully my next video won't take as long, but I can't guarantee that.